Hello and welcome to our show, 60 Seconds with Sergio. I am your host, Sergio Cabanas, attorney at law here in Florida. Thank you for joining me today. Today's question is, Sergio, I've heard of this concept known as temporary alimony that's sometimes awarded in divorce cases in Florida. How does that work, and how does the court actually establish or calculate this temporary alimony in my case? Well, the best way of answering this question is looking at the scenario that may exist behind the divorce case. For example, there are many cases where one of the spouses is earning the vast majority of the income, perhaps all of the income, and controls all of the finances. We're going to call that person the money spouse for the purposes of this video. Then we have the other spouse we're going to call the dependent spouse, who relies on that economic and financial support from the money spouse. So then we take a look at what happens when there's a separation or one of the parties initiates a divorce. Well, in those cases, oftentimes the money spouse decides to cut off the financial support to the other dependent spouse, sometimes because they have to, sometimes out of malice. So Florida law offers two layers of protections for this dependent spouse in those situations. One of the protections is what's called a status quo order. That is, when a divorce is filed with the court will usually grant automatically something called a status quo order. That's a court order that obligates the parties to maintain the status quo. In this case, that would mean that the spouse who was paying all of the expenses prior to the divorce or separation must continue to maintain those expenses after the divorce has been initiated. So if that spouse, the money spouse, decides to cut off, reduce, or eliminate any of that financial support, the dependent spouse has a right to enforce that court order, and the judge will force or obligate that person to maintain the expenses during a divorce case is pending. The second layer of protection, and this is where this temporary alimony or temporary spousal support comes into play. In those same scenarios where there's a dependent spouse and a money spouse, the dependent spouse may go to court and file a special motion asking that the money spouse pay additional expenses, such as a mortgage, any other travel expenses, schools for the children, extracurricular activities, and so on and so forth. The dependent spouse may even request that the money spouse pay for his or her attorney's fees, which is also good to know. You should also be aware that even in cases where neither of the parties has initiated a divorce, but the dependent spouse needs that financial support after a separation, the dependent spouse may actually file a special motion with the court to request that the court obligate the money spouse to maintain certain expenses during the separation without necessarily pursuing a divorce. So just keep in mind that these orders, the status quo order, as well as the temporary alimony, is only active during the pendency of the divorce case. The idea is that we maintain these expenses until the judge is able to make a final decision and enter a final judgment for the divorce, which will decide all of the issues, at which time the judge may order some other type of alimony that will replace the temporary alimony that's already in place. I hope this short video provided you at least some guidance over how temporary alimony and status quo orders work in a divorce case. Of course, this is not a substitute for an actual consultation with an attorney who's experienced and knowledgeable about divorce laws, who can help you with the specifics of your case. Thank you again for joining me, and as always, stay informed so you can stay strong.